I want to start today by sharing with you something out of my personal bio, not my professional bio. And that's the fact that I'm a pilot by hobby. And I've always been fascinated by the connections that I make between my interest in aviation and what it is that you do for your clients every single day. And I want to tell you a story about a couple of those connections that I've made. But in order for this story to make sense, you need to take this flight along with me. You need to be a passenger on Flight 1549, 500 feet off the Hudson River, and having just barely cleared the George Washington Bridge. And I want you to ask yourself a question. How valuable would it be to you and I as passengers on this flight to be able to freeze time just long enough for the flight attendants to get back up and run through that emergency water landing procedure just one more time, right? Maybe we weren't paying attention back on the ground in LaGuardia. But that's the first connection that I made to this story, that the value of advice is not only based on the content we deliver, but also the timing in which we deliver it. Now, a few seconds go by and splash, we're in the Hudson River. Now, there's not one of us on this flight that doesn't understand it's time to stand up, find the nearest exit, and get off that airplane, right? And that's the second connection that I made, that having clarity of purpose drives action. So putting those two connections in terms of what it is you do for your clients every single day, it's my belief that if we provide clients with timely and meaningful advice in sufficient quantity, that they're able to gain clarity, it's more likely that they'll take action.
Look at the 2011 budget, because the obvious answer and what we hear from Washington is we just need to cut spending and cut it quickly. Well, the 2011 federal budget was $3.8 trillion. Again, the good news is we're coming in at $3.6 trillion. But 58% of the 2011 budget is being spent on mandatory entitlements. And that's just the garden variety mandatory entitlements of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So we've talked about the changing demographics within the United States. What do you think is going to happen to that portion of the budget over the next 10, 15 years? It's just going to continue to expand, right? Now, 6% of our budget is currently being spent on debt service. And if you ask the White House, they tell us to expect that that portion of the budget will quadruple in the next 10 years. 23% of the budget is being spent on defense. So that's 87% of our budget that either historically won't change or cannot be changed without changing the laws.
Just for fun, I thought it would be interesting to look at this mandatory spending portion of our budget, and I included not only the entitlement spending, but also debt service, because obviously we need to pay that. So I wanted to look at that in dollar terms, and if you look at the budget, $3.6 trillion times 64% of the budget, the United States federal government in 2011 spent $2.3 trillion on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and debt service. Now I thought the more interesting question to ask, well, how much revenue does the federal government bring in from all federal tax receipts? And again, the budget tells us $3.6 trillion minus a $1.3 trillion deficit. The U.S. federal government's only bringing in $2.3 trillion. So that means we have financed 2 wars, every government agency, every social program, and stimulus, all by borrowing money. So you understand that this is not a sustainable environment that we find ourselves in. We hear that on the news all the time. And believe it or not, both parties understand this basic arithmetic. They understand the situation we're in, but they have very different views as to how to move forward. And I call those different views impediments for moving forward, because they come from all 3 parties, the President, the Republicans, and the Democrats. The President has said very plainly from his 2008 election campaign all the way through his road shows that he's on right now, that he will not raise taxes on any families earning less than $250,000. Despite the fact that a report came out in late April, early May of this year that said 45% of American families paid 0 federal income taxes. You probably heard that statistic, right? I think there was a more interesting statistic in that same report, but it didn't get nearly as much press. It actually said that 45% of American families actually received a positive cash flow from the federal government. Not just 0, a positive cash flow. Now, I know there's some double counting there. You have Social Security recipients who are still working, and so they would be double counted. But that's a relatively small number. Bottom line is, the situation we find ourselves in, we have this environment of 55% of American families paying into the system, and 45% of American families taking out. And it's simply not a long-term workable scenario. But the Republicans aren't any better. They're saying, we're not going to raise taxes on anyone. despite the fact that the United States federal revenue is at a inflation-adjusted level lower than it's been since 1958. Now, the Democrats, they said they will not entertain any solutions on the back of retiree benefits, entitlements. Now, that makes all the sense in the world for people who are 65 now or 70 or 75 in retirement. It makes no sense at all for individuals who are 20 and 25 and 30 years old who have time to adjust their planning with the help of individuals such as yourself. So that if you think about it, that's really the battlefield that every issue our country is facing has to be fought on. And I'm going to come back to that battlefield discussion and move to is jobs. Surely we can all agree we need more jobs, and we certainly do. But I really see this boiling down to a short-term versus a long-term dilemma. And what I mean by that is deficit reduction, as the Republicans have put forward, is by definition anti-jobs in the short and intermediate term. Now, the Republicans would argue that it sets us up much more favorably long-term for economic growth, and that's true. But it definitely is anti-jobs in the short run. Stimulus, on the other hand, as President Obama has proposed, is pro-jobs in the short run. If the government's spending more money on projects, infrastructure, whatever they spend their money on, that will have some trickle effect down to growing the job base. But then you have to grapple with an even larger debt situation down the road. And what is your plan for that? So it shouldn't surprise us at all that President Obama came out with a short-term solution. He came out with a $450 billion jobs plan that I'm sure you're fully aware of. The reason why is he has a short-term need. What's his short-term need? To get reelected, right? He wants all of us to feel better about the economy and our personal situation this time next year. And so it shouldn't surprise us that he came out with this stimulative, short-term jobs plan. Now, we know the jobs bill died in a procedural vote in the Senate. So what you're seeing now is the Senate Democrats pulling this jobs bill apart and seeing if they can find anywhere for compromise within the jobs bill. I think they also have another motive, because the first thing they pulled out was state aid. State aid was specifically designed to give the states more money so they could either maintain employment levels or hire new teachers, police, and firemen. Of course, it died because the Republicans will not approve any additional spending, and that's given President Obama something to add to his stump speech, that the Republicans won't even support teachers and firemen and policemen. The second thing that they pulled out was infrastructure. Now, we all know that we have an infrastructure issue in the United States. The bottom line is spending on infrastructure today will not get approved by Republicans. We know that. Again, adding to the president's stump speech and so forth. Now, one area that I do think there is potential compromise is around the Social Security tax reduction. As you know, in 2011, the employees are paying less in payroll taxes. Now, what President Obama is suggesting here is that in 2012 only, both employees and employers will pay 50% of their tax liability. 6.2%, they'll only pay 3.1%. Now, what's interesting about that, you probably read this week that Social Security in 2012, if this tax cut goes into play, will actually not be able to fund itself. So they'll have to go into the general account, i.e. more debt for the United States, to supplement the spending within Social Security. And sadly, I think you would all agree, you understand how Social Security works. In the time when Social Security is feeling the stress of the baby boomers coming into retirement, we're actually shorting the amount of money that we're putting into the trust fund, which I think we would all agree makes no sense at all. But I think Republicans would have a very hard time not signing this bill. They would have a very hard time signing it because they said, we want to reduce taxes. Here's a chance to do it. And then with a simple signature vote, they could pass a lower tax rate for 2012. So again, I think that's one area of potential compromise. I do put that slightly less than 50-50 at this point, but nonetheless, it's certainly possible that President Obama has shifted over the last month and a half from presiding President Obama to campaign President Obama. And what I mean by that, President Obama historically has been what I would call a parachute president. And what I mean is that he was more than content to allow the Republicans and Democrats to come together and fight over these issues. And at the last minute, parachute in, broker a deal that quite honestly neither party was happy with, But bottom line, get something done. That's a fabulous way to be a president of the United States. And the reason why is that speaks directly to the independent voter. Independent voters, as you know, are the group of voters that drive the presidential election. So independent voters truly respond to an individual who can broker a deal across these fighting factions. So that's the way he chose to preside. But what we've seen now, through the jobs bill and the way he's using those pieces and his long-term debt reduction proposal, which is dead, that was a signal, a shot across the bow to the Republicans that I'm shifting gears, I'm now in campaign mode, and I'm going to set myself up to win. I'll let you in on probably one of the biggest secrets in Washington, D.C. The Republicans don't want President Obama to be reelected. So, in case you were wondering, that's one of the biggest
recently, and I thought it was absolutely fabulous quote. This came out from the White House, and I'm going to summarize what this says, or paraphrase what this says. It's from President Obama to the Republicans, and it simply says that, hey, Republicans, I've asked you all along for a balanced approach. And what I mean by that is I'm willing to give you spending cuts, but I want revenue increases, in other words, tax increases. If you fail to give me this balanced approach, I have a trump card in my pocket. And that trump card is the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. And I am fully prepared to allow the Bush tax cuts to expire on those families earning more than $250,000, but veto the portion of the bill that would apply to any families earning less than $250,000. So the reason this quote is fascinating, one, is it gave us perfectly clear, crystal quality view into what President Obama's belief is, what needs to happen around the taxation system in the United States. He believes the wealthiest portion of our population needs to be actively paying a higher contribution into the revenue stream. But what made this really fascinating was that it's factually wrong. The president can't do this. He can't veto half a law. Our president does not have line item veto power. So he'll be in a situation during that lame duck session next November and December and early January that he will be forced to make a decision of letting the Bush tax cuts expire on everyone or no one. That is his only choice unless Congress puts forth a more thoughtful approach to tax reform.